Hey, Mike, good afternoon. It's great to chat to you this afternoon. First of all, before we dive in, just a huge congratulations on your PhD. I know it's been a big piece of work, and I was struck by your findings, which to me were very counterintuitive. I mean, I know that your research over the years focused on these, mega projects that you studied around the world, more than $1 billion US in spend, I think, each of those projects that you looked at, and the factors that drove success or otherwise of those projects. But I guess for me, I was really bumfuzzled or bemused or interested in the sort of killer fact to me was your finding around that of the 14 most important factors that drove the success of these projects, these mega projects, that 9 of the 14 were what you called, I believe, implicit versus the explicit factors. And I'd be interested to know more about that. And you might just talk a little bit about what were the implicit and explicit sort of things, and particularly, what we can learn more broadly as managers and leaders around that.
Yeah, sure, Chris. It was a fascinating journey. And the curiosity struck me was that infrastructure projects, particularly these huge, big infrastructure projects, don't have a good track record of being managed successfully. And I was curious as to why that was. And there'd been quite a lot of management research done around complexity and management of complexity, and the requirement to manage complexity required a very different approach. And so I took that concept and explored whether or not that may be applicable to managing these big infrastructure projects. So the whole context is very much broader than just infrastructure projects, but for my PhD, obviously I needed something. It's obvious. If you know about a PhD, it's got to be very, very focused.
Sure.
I just picked on particular infrastructure projects in a particular marketplace. So the context is management theory is all about controls. The concepts are around governance, controls, organisation, setting the standards, managing towards the standards, etc., etc. What complexity theory suggests is that if you need to manage something complex, you need to let go of control. You need to delegate, empower, and let people within your team self-manage or even self-organise. And those are interesting concepts. So self-management means through delegation and empowerment, the team can manage themselves and manage what they're doing. Self-organisation is where you create a climate or a culture where people just organise to deal with it, whatever their requirements are. So it's counterintuitive because it talks about moving away from controls. So part of my research was then looking at those concepts to see whether or not they were being applied in mega infrastructure projects and whether or not that was a solution to actually making these big projects successful.
Yeah. And
in fact, if people didn't apply these principles, was that one of the reasons why the projects were not being successful?
Yeah. And I guess, as managers and leaders, and actually intuitively, I suppose when we feel out of control, the first thing we try and do is clamp down and get more and more control. And I guess what you're saying is actually the evidence or the research says that actually we should fight the urge, if you will. And I know with complexity theory, it talks about being more open, more curious, more adaptable, nimble, if you will, but opening up rather than closing down, if you will, which is completely counterintuitive.
Well, it's counterintuitive to traditional management.
Yeah, good point. Fair point. Yeah.
So I people talk anecdotally about hard and soft factors in management, and I wanted to get away from those because it's the hard managers think all the soft stuff is soft, whereas the soft stuff is probably the harder stuff to actually do. So academic research talks about explicit factors and implicit factors. So there's things that are explicit to management, things like budgets, programs, timelines, quality control, delegations of authority, organisational structures. They're explicit factors of management. The implicit factors around management are things like culture, communication, knowledge sharing,
Where does
trust.
trust? Yeah, there you go. Okay. Yeah.
They're implicit management factors. And so one of the management theories I used for my research was a concept called contingency theory. And this is a very old concept which was developed in the UK in the 1960s. Well, the concept is the way you manage an organisation is contingent on the internal and external factors you've got to deal with. So that theory actually says there's no right or wrong way to manage something. You just need the management approach you need to use has to be contingent on what you're trying to manage and the environment you're trying to manage within. So if you're running a plant building widgets, then the approach should be quite mechanistic because it's all about quality control, process. You need to make sure you're getting bang for your buck. Whereas if you're managing something like, imagine something like a home care nursing, where you're providing nursing services to people in their homes, that needs what's called an organic approach, far more like an organism rather than like a machine, where people can be very agile, can make decisions, move, depending, because the circumstances that people may find in that sort of environment may change and may be very different.
So you're saying
this approach would not work.
So I guess it's situational, horses for courses, but I don't think you're arguing that you need to be all implicit, if you will, versus explicit, or one or the other. It's a combination of both, surely.
Well, that's right. So where that fits with the mechanistic organic model is, most of us who went to management school in the last 20 years were only taught a mechanistic approach. We weren't taught an organic approach. The organic approach says you should dial up more of the implicit factors and much less of the explicit factors. It doesn't say you should have no explicit factors. It just says they're not as important.
Right. Okay. So if I'm in a law firm, if I'm in a financial services executive role, if I'm in the infrastructure development space, I mean, what is the real, what do I take away from this? Like, how do I make this real in my job to help me be even better in the role I'm doing as a manager and leader?
So one of the things I looked at was how do you determine the level of complexity in an organisation? And if you could measure that, then you could determine how much you needed to be more organic and less mechanistic, or more mechanistic and less organic. In other words, more explicit factors and less implicit, or the other way around. And so there's a number of things you need to look at, and this comes back also to management theory as well. So if you're running an organisation that's like a law firm, where there are lots and lots of moving parts, things can change quite rapidly. You've got highly capable people within the team. Applying a mechanistic approach to those and relying solely on explicit factors to manage that organisation, you can probably imagine as we're talking that would create a whole lot of friction, a whole lot of controls that would prevent people being the best at what they can be. And financial services probably very similarly. If you're running we don't do this anymore now, but you can imagine a typing pool, or a manufacturing plant in an industry I work in.
Well, maybe a call center, or it's homogenous
yes,
type work. Yeah.
Then there's a whole lot of process in those organisations, which is necessary to maintain standards, et cetera, and controls. However, you can imagine that if it's all mechanistic and no organic process, no implicit factors, then it could, the turnover rates traditionally in call centres are huge. And possibly that's because people don't invest in the implicit factors around culture, trust, communication, et cetera.
It's a very interesting point about how you measure the real cost of that. And even in terms of how that flows through into, say, the customer experience. I'm sure we've all complained about that now.
Well, exactly. Customer-facing organisations are very different again. And if you look at the mechanistic organic theories, you wouldn't apply a mechanistic approach to a customer-facing organisation. It's the wrong approach given the contingent environment you're working within.
Interesting. Okay, so it's situational, horses for courses, mixture of explicit and implicit factors, There's a fair bit of judgment required, and it sounds like the degree to which it's the split, if you will, between implicit and explicit is largely driven by the level of the complexity of the nature of the work. If it's more homogeneous, it might look different than a law firm or infrastructure development or whatever.
Yes, yes. It's two things: the nature of the work and the environment you're working within.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, great. Hey, Mike, thanks a million. This is really fascinating stuff. I guess if people want to know more, I don't know that they'll want to work through 120 some odd thousand word dissertation, but I'm sure we can provide some sort of précis for them. In fact, maybe we do that afterwards. So
certainly, Chris, happy to share. It's a fascinating stuff.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time.
All the best.
You too.